The park was a different world after dark. During the day, it roared with color and movement. Laughter echoing from the carousel, children running past popcorn stands, and the rattle of the coaster tracks overhead. But once the last ride stopped and the final family left, a quiet hush fell over everything. That's when Reed felt most himself. He had been a night technician at the park for almost 6 years. Every evening after the crowds dispersed, he checked every ride, every switch, every circuit that could break down in the silence. He knew each creak of the Ferris wheel, each hum of the carousel motor, each flicker of the overhead bulbs. The machines never lied. They just needed attention. The air was cooler at night, touched with the smell of oil, rain-damp wood, and the last of the cotton candy sugar still clinging to the trash bins. Reed didn't mind. He walked the paths with his flashlight in one hand and a set of keys jangling from his belt. There was comfort in the routine. Then, on a Tuesday near the end of the season, Caleb appeared. Reed first noticed him leaning near the entrance gate, clipboard in hand, posture quiet but not unsure. He was younger, mid to late 20s, maybe, and wore the same dark parachute jacket, though his looked newer, stiffer. His eyes scanned the grounds not like someone guarding them, but like someone searching for something forgotten. No one had told Reed a new night guard was starting. But the park's management often forgot to update him about things that didn't directly involve cables or engines. Still, the presence of someone new unsettled the rhythm. That first night, they didn't speak much. A nod, a glance, a muttered acknowledgement. Caleb walked his routes, Reed walked his. They crossed paths only a few times, near the Tilt-A-Whirl or behind the food stalls, never long enough to form any impression. But Reed noticed small things. Caleb always walked slowly past the bumper cars. He sometimes lingered by the carousel, even when his patrol didn't call for it. He had a habit of adjusting his gloves even when it wasn't cold. Reed wasn't sure why he was paying attention. It had been a long time since he'd looked at anyone that way. Not with interest, but with curiosity. Most nights, he preferred silence. People were unpredictable, noisy. But Caleb moved through the park the way Reed did, deliberately, quietly, with a kind of reverence. The second week brought rain, not the sharp kind that passed quickly, but a steady drizzle that made everything look like it had been varnished in moonlight. Reed wore his hood up and worked through the soaked walkways, checking the circuit boxes and making sure the lights didn't short. He passed Caleb once, under the flickering sign of the haunted house, and their eyes met. There was a flicker of recognition. No words. Just an unspoken acknowledgement that they were both out in the wet, alone together. By the end of the third week, a rhythm began to form. They didn't coordinate, but their breaks started overlapping. Reed would find himself near the small bench by the funhouse at the same time Caleb passed by, pausing just long enough to stretch or sip from a thermos. The silence between them wasn't awkward. It was chosen. Sometimes, Reed would look up from fixing a panel and see Caleb watching him. Not staring, just noticing, like someone taking in a painting they didn't quite understand. It wasn't friendship yet. It wasn't even familiarity. But something was shifting. One night, Reed climbed to the top of the Ferris wheel platform to reset the lights. From up there, he could see most of the park sprawled below, lights glowing under the drizzle, walkways empty and quiet. And at the far end, near the old concession stands, he saw Caleb standing still, looking out toward the edge of the fence where the land dropped into the river. Reed watched him for a moment. He wondered what kept the man staring out that way, what he was hoping to find in the dark. Back on the ground, Reed passed the ride panel one last time, checked the locks, and marked the shift log. When he walked past the old games arcade, he noticed something new. 2 mugs resting on the bench, still warm, one with steam curling into the air. Caleb wasn't there, but one of the mugs had a note taped to it. In case you forget to take a break. It was in sign scrawled quickly, not meant to impress. But Reed held the cup a little longer than he needed to. He didn't smile, not outwardly, but something under his skin softened. The night stretched on, as usual, but nothing felt quite the same anymore. The next few nights blurred together in a rhythm of light and shadow. Reed continued his rounds, but something in his pace had changed. He noticed it in the way he lingered near the carousel longer than necessary, or how his eyes glanced toward the arcade bench even when he didn't expect anything new. The small, ordinary rituals of maintenance began to feel charged with something different. Not quite anticipation, not yet hope, but curiosity was growing. Caleb didn't leave another note. He didn't need to. The silence between them now had a shape, a structure. It wasn't empty anymore. It held the memory of the shared thermos, the unspoken offer of connection. And as the days passed, Reed began to observe more than just Caleb's route. He saw how the man ran his fingers along the rails of the kiddie coaster as he passed, almost like touching old piano keys. He noted how Caleb would pause near the control booth of the teacup, ride, and glance inside, as though he could imagine the laughter that had filled it hours earlier. He walked with quiet steps, sure, but never rushed, his flashlight always aimed low, never shining into the darkness like a threat. Reed didn't ask questions. He never had, but he started listening to the quiet between footsteps. That week, one of the string lights above the photo booth began to flicker. It wasn't urgent, just an inconsistency in the flow. Reed grabbed a ladder after his inspection round and made his way toward it. He was halfway through rewiring the faulty connection when he heard footsteps approaching over the gravel. He didn't turn. He didn't need to. He could already tell who it was by the even, unhurried pace. Caleb stopped a few feet behind him. The light cast a soft glow on the nearby sign. Neither of them spoke. Reed's hands worked steadily, untwisting wires, inspecting the bulb housing. There was no rush in either of them. After a long pause, Caleb stepped forward, not close, but close enough that his presence was no longer just in the periphery. Reed felt the warmth of it before he heard the faint exhale, the kind that came not from exhaustion, but from quiet presence. Reed finished the repair in silence. He tested the light. It glowed steadily. Satisfied, he climbed down, his boots thudding softly on the damp ground. For a moment, they stood side by side beneath the fixed light. It hummed gently overhead, casting a soft amber halo around their feet. Reed finally looked over, and Caleb nodded once, an acknowledgement, a thank you, or maybe something else entirely. It didn't matter. The moment already held enough weight. The next night, the carousel refused to start. Reed spent an hour trying to locate the short. It wasn't in the panel or the wiring beneath the platform. The rain from earlier that week may have seeped into the motor housing. Frustration itched at the edges of his calm, but he refused to let it surface. When he crawled out from beneath the ride, Caleb was there again. This time, he was holding a portable lantern, its light a softer alternative to the harsh beam of a flashlight. He sat on the ground nearby, without a word, and crouched beside the toolkit Reed had left open. There was no offer to help, just quiet accompaniment. Reed returned to the wiring. Eventually, he found the moisture damage and rerouted the connection. The motor gave a slow hum, then kicked into life, rotating the platform gently, its faded horses bobbing in rhythm. Reed didn't say anything, but as they stood watching the carousel spin without music, the moment felt almost reverent. Caleb turned to leave, but before he did, he pulled something small from his pocket, a folded ticket stub from one of the old haunted rides, now closed for years. He tucked it into the edge of the carousel boost console like a tiny offering. Then he walked away. Reed remained for several minutes after, hands in his jacket pockets, watching the horses rise and fall in the quiet night. He didn't remove the ticket. Back at the brake station, Reed sat on the bench, thermos in hand. His fingers traced the grooves in the wood, worn by time and use. The park had always felt frozen after dark, like a photograph taken just after the last scream faded. But now, it felt like something was moving beneath the surface. Not fast, not loud, but alive. He didn't know if Caleb was just being kind or if his quiet choreography between them meant more. He wasn't sure he wanted to name it yet. Sometimes, naming something too early made it disappear. But for the first time in a long while, Reed didn't feel like the last one left behind after the lights went out. He felt noticed, and that, in itself, was enough to make the night seem warmer than it was. By the third week of their quiet dance, the park began to feel less like a workplace and more like a shared memory neither of them had spoken aloud. The carousel spun smoother now, and the flickering bulbs above the game booths stayed lit through the night. Reed kept working, his toolbox always a few paces behind him, as if he were rebuilding the park piece by piece. But something inside him shifted. He'd started to anticipate moments. Caleb's silent approach, the way his flashlight swept calmly over familiar structures, the quiet clink of his thermos cap opening when he thought no one was nearby. On a Friday evening, the rain returned, not a gentle mist this time, but a sudden downpour that came without warning. Reed had just begun his second round of inspections when the first crack of thunder rolled low and long across the sky. Within minutes, the park was drenched. Water gathered in the grooves of the walkways, pooling at the edges of the food stalls and swirling down the forgotten corners near the service gate. Lights began to dim and flicker. Somewhere near the center of the park, the old octopus ride groaned and seized mid-spin. Reed cursed under his breath. He grabbed his rain jacket and sprinted toward the ride, boots splashing through puddles, toolkit bouncing against his leg. The octopus ride had been on its last legs for months. Too much rust, too many broken parts no one bothered to replace. But tonight, its failure felt more personal. When he reached the platform, he was already soaked to the bone. He climbed up, struggling with the manual override while the wind pushed hard against the ride's frame. Water ran in rivulets along the control box, and he used his sleeve to wipe it clean enough to see. A voice didn't call out, but a beam of light swept across the base of the platform, steady and clear. Reed looked down and saw Caleb holding a large umbrella in one hand and a lantern in the other. Without a word, Caleb climbed the stairs and held the umbrella over them both, angling it so it covered most of the panel. His jacket was soaked along the edges, his boots muddy, but he didn't seem bothered. Reed didn't speak. He just returned to the wiring, grateful in a way he didn't know how to express. With Caleb's help shielding the controls, Reed finally managed to force a full shutoff. The arms of the ride drooped slowly, coming to a rest. The rain drummed hard on the canopy above, but in that small pocket of stillness beneath the umbrella, the two of them stood quietly, rainwater trickling down their backs, breath visible in the damp night air. When the immediate issue was handled, they descended the steps together and took cover in the small control booth nearby. It was barely large enough for two, and the space smelled of dust, oil, and wetwood. Caleb set the lantern on the control panel, its soft glow illuminating the worn faces of past ride operators scratched into the wood. Reed peeled off his soaked jacket and leaned against the side wall, arms crossed. Caleb did the same, sitting on a small bench meant for a single person. Their knees almost touched in the tight space. The silence was longer this time, and heavier. Then Reed, for the first time in years, began to speak. He talked about the early years, when the park still felt magical. About the time he used to work in the daytime, when families would wave and thank him for fixing their favorite ride. How it had all slowed down after that. How time moved differently once he switched to nights, quieter, lonelier. He didn't embellish. He didn't dramatize. He just told the truth. Caleb listened without shifting, his eyes fixed on a spot just above the lantern's glow. When Reed paused, unsure whether to continue, Caleb finally spoke, just a few sentences, about being between places, about a recent move he hadn't wanted to make, about how this job was supposed to be temporary, a way to stay grounded while figuring out the next step. And then he stopped, as if he didn't want to say too much. Reed didn't push, but there was a mutual understanding, blooming slowly in the low light. They had both come here for the silence. And yet now, the quiet was no longer empty. It was shared. Outside, the rain eased into a mist. The thunder rolled away toward the hills. Caleb stood first, brushing off his sleeves. Reed followed, grabbing his toolkit, and together they walked through the dam park. Lights had returned, softly glowing behind the remaining fog. The octopus ride sat motionless, but at peace. As they reached the service gate, Caleb paused. He didn't say goodnight. He didn't need to. Instead, he pulled the folded umbrella from his side and handed it to Reed. Their fingers touched briefly to skin, no words. Then he turned and disappeared into the dark, leaving Reed standing in the mist with a damp umbrella, a heart that beat too loud, and the unmistakable feeling that something had begun that night. something neither of them had planned. The rain didn't return the next night, but something else had vanished instead: Caleb. For the first time in 2 weeks, his flashlight wasn't visible at the edge of the funhouse. He didn't appear during rounds or at the security checkpoint near the carousel. Reed noticed this immediately, though he pretended not to. He told himself it wasn't important that people got sick or changed schedules all the time. Still, as the hours stretched on, his footsteps echoed louder than usual across the pavement. Reed walked past the bench by the arcade 3 times that night, each time slower than the last. The second time, he paused just long enough to sit, hoping that maybe Caleb would materialize from the shadows like usual. But the bench stayed empty, and the night dragged on without rhythm. Machines didn't care about absence. They still needed tending. The lights still hummed, the cables still wore down, and the grease still clung to the bolts like old dust. But Reed's concentration wavered. When he opened the control box to the spinning saucers, he caught himself staring at the wiring too long, forgetting why he'd opened it in the first place. He didn't notice the loose screw that rolled off the bench until he stepped on it an hour later. Everything felt misaligned, like a song that had lost its tempo. By the time his shift ended, he was more tired than usual, though the tasks had been lighter. He returned to the booth where they'd once waited out the storm, and for a few moments he simply stood there, one hand on the doorway, as if waiting for something to stir. Nothing did. The following night, Caleb was back. Reed spotted him from a distance, walking along the edge of the prize stalls, head slightly lowered, hands in his pockets. His steps were slower, and he didn't carry his flashlight. Instead, he moved like someone who had memorized the shadows. They crossed paths near the base of the Ferris wheel. Reed didn't speak, and neither did Caleb. But something passed between them anyway. Not tension exactly, but a kind of caution. Like two people returning to a conversation after saying too much or not enough. It wasn't until they met again later that night at the maintenance garage near the tilt ride that Reed finally asked what had happened. Caleb only shrugged. He didn't offer an excuse. He didn't fill the silence. He just stood there, looking slightly more weathered than usual, his eyes a little softer at the corners. They worked side by side that evening, not in assigned roles, but in unspoken cooperation. Reed adjusted loose fittings along the railing, while Caleb swept up broken leaves that had blown in from the lot. Their movements were quiet but aligned, a rhythm re-established. Later, when the park was at its quietest, they stood near the back lot fence, facing the empty field beyond. It was the kind of stillness Reed had always loved, heavy with nighttime fog, the hum of distant cables vibrating faintly through the air. But now, the silence had a new weight. It wasn't lonely. It was full. Reed found himself thinking about the first time he saw Caleb walk through the gate. How different he seemed now, not just in posture, but in presence. Caleb, who once hovered on the edge of things, now stood grounded beside him, as if the space had always been meant for two. The carousel lights flickered off one by one behind them. A few moments later, Caleb turned to Reed, not with words, but with a nod toward the bench they sometimes shared. Without needing an invitation, Reed followed. They didn't sit close, but they didn't sit apart either. No words passed between them that night. But Reed knew something had changed. There was no need for declarations, no confessions, only a quiet settling of something that had long been unsettled. When Caleb left at the end of his shift, he paused briefly near the arcade. For the first time, he turned back, just for a second, just long enough to make Reed feel like this wasn't just a fleeting rhythm born of routine. It was something deeper, something real. The silence in the park remained, but now it felt less like a void and more like a canvas. And in the middle of it, two men had begun to write something, not with words, but with presence, consistency, and trust built under soft lights and spinning rides. The last week of the season always came faster than expected. Most visitors didn't notice the subtle winding down of the park, how the colors lost a bit of their brightness, how the music felt more like background than celebration. But Reed noticed. He always did. The final stretch before winter meant shutting down each attraction piece by piece, checking circuits, draining lines, wrapping wires with labels that would sit untouched for months. There was a kind of sadness to it. Not grief exactly, just the stillness that followed something once full of motion. This time, though, the end didn't feel as heavy. Caleb was still there. His rounds had become shorter, as some sections no longer required monitoring. That meant their paths overlapped more, often deliberately. They didn't talk about it, didn't label it. But Reed found himself setting down 2 thermos mugs at the break bench now, not just one. Caleb sometimes brought fruit or wrapped pastries from the day's shift kitchen. Small, silent gestures, but each one carried a weight greater than its size. On the second to last night, they worked together without speaking. The lights along the Ferris wheel were the final task. Bulbs needed to be removed, wires sealed. Reed climbed the ladder while Caleb steadied the base. Their movements had become a practiced rhythm. No instructions needed. No second guesses. Above the park, Reed could see the rooftops of the nearby buildings, their windows glowing faintly. He lingered longer than he needed just to watch, just to feel the air. When he descended, Caleb was still there, still holding the ladder, still looking up. The look wasn't intense. It was quiet, like a moment held in place, waiting for nothing more than to be seen. They didn't go their separate ways after finishing. Instead, they walked together along the quiet stretch of game stalls. Most of the prizes had been packed away. The only sound was the soft thud of their boots and the distant hum of the generator winding down. Near the arcade, Reed stopped. He didn't say anything, just sat on the bench where it had all quietly started. Caleb joined him. There was no rain this time, no broken lights, no excuses, only silence, and the steady heartbeat of something unspoken but understood. Reed turned slightly, just enough to glance at Caleb's hands. They rested loosely on his knees, fingers relaxed, as if the tension that had once lived in his posture had finally gone still. A breath passed, and another. Then Caleb, in a voice low enough to barely rise above the breeze, said something simple. Not a confession, not a question, just the truth. I don't want this to end with the season. It was the first full sentence Reed had heard from him that didn't sound like routine. Reed didn't answer with words. Instead, he reached forward and set his hand, quietly, deliberately, on Caleb's. No pressure, no urgency, just presence. Their eyes met for a moment. Not long, but long enough. And then the moment passed, and they sat there as they always had, shoulder to shoulder, not needing to fill the silence. When the sun began to lighten the sky hours later, the park was still. For once, Reed didn't feel the usual ache of things ending. There was no bitterness, no heaviness, only something new, possibility. In the weeks that followed, the park would close. The rides would sleep. The lights would go dark until spring. But Reed wouldn't walk alone anymore. Because sometimes, even in the most forgotten corners of quiet places, something lasting could begin. Not in a rush, not in a spark, but in a slow, steady glow, flickering first, then burning steady, like a light that had finally found its home.